Okay, we're back. Part 2, we're talking about picking the psychometric tests, right? And you can see the various realm of psychometric tests in which we might be interested. So, choosing psychometric tests, if we're talking about personality, what do we know about traits? Well, traits are defined as stable, enduring characteristics, right? And a lot of traits, are theorized to kind of coalesce in adolescence, kind of as identity is forming. Perhaps before that, but I mean really kind of become consistent in adolescence, and they're not generally all that, we can't expect to see a lot of transformation necessarily in traits. That's something that I would not expect to happen in adults, although it certainly is possible. There are exceptions, but I wouldn't look to that. And the correlate to that is rule number 2 in psychology: you can't change people. That is, you can't have them develop new traits. But what does a trait do for us? Well, it can kind of expect a behavioral style across a wide range of situations and contexts. Okay? Typically employs relatively opaque questions, opaque meaning not clear to discern what exactly the question is tapping into. So more effective trait measures usually kind of hide the intention of the measure of the question, so that it can eliminate some favorable responding bias. People kind of trying to pull the wool over our eyes by telling us what we want to hear, what they think is a desirable trait, rather than the trait they possess. And now you can see where we get into these issues with trait measures that may be used to deceive us as to the person's actual character rather than not. Right? Now, the temporary condition, the state, is situationally dependent and typically employs more transparent questions. State-type measures that tap into what the person is behaving like now or what the person is thinking now might actually be more useful, because we can combine them with situational tasks, right, rather than trait-type tasks. So state versus trait is always kind of a tricky issue. Trait-type tests are often contaminated by the participant's current state. So that is, you may be normally a kind person, but you got in a small accident on the way. It was just a fender bender. You thought it'd be easy, but the person lays into you. It gets to be a big ugly scene, and then you get to the job interview. Trait type measures might be kind of somewhat contaminated by your current experience, your current state, right? Also, if the testing environment is variable, then we might affect people on trait measures because they were greeted by someone who was pleasant, a tester, or someone who was unpleasant, and that might affect the trait measures as well. One big problem is the existence of a trait can sensitize participants to the feature of the environment. And this is kind of the flip side. We found this in a lot of our research in the lab, that certain manipulations will affect certain people with an existing trait, while they won't affect someone with another trait. One example of this was, we found it was very easy to prime people with authoritarian level traits to become more punitive in our research, whereas people who are not authoritarians didn't respond to the primes in the same way. So there can be an interaction between state and trait. Again, these kind of tricky issues point us back to maybe the utility of behavioral measures. That is, crafting situations where we see how a person behaves that is most similar to what they might encounter on the job. We do a good job of operationalizing, we do a good job of developing a scoring rubric that's meaningful to rank order candidates on behavioral qualities that might be useful or detrimental to the job. So personality tests, rarely used in selection, and I think the less they're used, the better off we're going to be. Many of you have voiced the issue that I don't want people delving into my personality. I'm down with you. My wife is just going through this noxious Big 5 stuff that they're going to do at her work now. And it's like, well, personalysis was used 2 years ago up till now, and now all of a sudden we're not doing personalysis anymore, we're going to Big 5. It gives you an idea of how meaningless these things are if you can just substitute one for another after 2 years. What are you trying to accomplish? Why didn't the first one take care of, let's say, helping people work better in teams? Why do we have to go to this new one, right? All in all, I think personality tests are to be avoided to a certain extent. You can tell if someone's an extrovert by putting them in behavioral situations, right? I mean, at Boise Cascade, when I stood up and said to everyone, hey, how about you guys give me your ideas and I'll write them down and kind of so we can all see it together. I think at that point it should be pretty obvious that I'm one of the more extroverted people in the group, and you didn't have to find that out by giving me a Jungian typology or the Myers-Briggs. It was an observable behavior, not something that was determined by a trait-based test. Right? That could be faked. Right? The behavior is more difficult to fake, so probably the better way to go. Now, but you will work in places where they just want to do trait-based tests, and you're just going to have to put up with it, right? Now, tests can be arrayed on being broad spectrum or narrow spectrum. Broad spectrum tests assess personality across multiple dimensions and are applicable to a wider range of positions, if that's what we're looking to do. Probably not the best way to go. Narrow spectrum tests focus on the traits found to be critical to specific occupations. And I think when you guys developed a repertory grid on teachers, notice that initially you're kind of looking at broad spectrum constructs, but as you developed and fleshed out the repertory grid and actually developed your bipolar continuums, you're narrowing the spectrum, right? And you're narrowing what you consider successful performance or unsuccessful performance. And either way, though, defensibility can be an issue. And that may interfere with attempts to manage diversity. And this gets back to, is the test fair? And does it treat people equally across different groups, right? So behavioral tests, probably the better bet because they're more easily defended as well. And we're going to find that behavioral tests probably are less contaminated by ethnicity, culture, etc. So, measures of motivation. Everyone wants to. I want to hire highly motivated people. I don't want to hire people who lack motivation. And the problem with ideas like motivation, and similarly for emotion and psychology, is we can't even agree on a definition of motivation, nor can we agree on a definition of emotion. And let's face it, the cognitive psychologists were telling us through the 1980s that motivation didn't exist, that motivation was just a surrogate for various cognitive processes, that motivation didn't even exist. So to assess motivation in a way that we believe it's meaningful by using some kind of questionnaire, probably not going to be all that successful. What we can do is measure things like persistence in laboratory tasks. And we can observe, that is, how many of these puzzles does somebody attempt to do? How long do they work on these puzzles before they give up? Notice, these are measures of persistence, and this nebulous term motivation probably isn't as interesting to us as is the notion of persistence. So persistence is probably a better thing to measure than motivation would be, which is probably more general. Right? So perhaps, you know, one of the most the critical things is how hard is this person going to work for me? And that is to what extent will they persist on a task, I think, rather than, so let's use a term that's more directly associated with what we're trying to observe and the question we're trying to answer. Historically, the thematic apperception test was used. It's very difficult to score. It's an ambiguous test. It's a projective test. And motivational and value tests are pretty easily faked. That is, if you're asking me how motivated are you on a scale of 1 to 10, well, I'm applying for a job. Man, I'm 10 because I'm like motivated. I think behavioral and observational type tests and also work product is probably more important in this regard. So much better. Now, McClelland's need theory. McClelland was looking at people kind of on a trait level and what needs do they possess internally and how that need profile then qualifies them for certain positions superior performance in certain positions, or rather, inferior performance in those positions. So there's McClelland, and this is where he kind of really was groundbreaking, but I think we can move past it. It developed out of Murray's need theory, and he identified three basic needs. One is need for achievement, and to what extent, and notice these needs are something that we all vary on, that we have different levels of needs. So to what extent do you have a need for achievement? That is a desire to accomplish something difficult. Right? Now notice, I'm not saying that this is unimportant, but the way we assess it might be problematic. If I'm bringing someone into graduate school, I want to accept someone into graduate school, their need for achievement becomes pretty important. Their desire to accomplish something difficult, like complete their frickin' dissertation, right? To what extent is that something, that characteristic, that they have that kind of burning desire that they want to get this done? Which might translate into their willingness to work till 2 or 3 a.m., right, for a month at a time to get this finished. To what extent do they need to achieve? But notice, this is not motivation, it's the motivation to achieve, but they're not using the term motivation, they're using need to achieve. To what extent does this person demonstrate a need for affiliation? And that's a desire to spend time in social relationships and activities. If we're looking for team players, then assessing need for affiliation might be relatively important. And then need for power, the desire to influence, to coach, to teach, to encourage others. And this would be kind of a core leadership quality, if you will. To what extent is someone motivated to lead others? What we look at then is the thematic apperception test, and the way this works, and you can see how the difficulty here. Sochi is about to jump onto my window covering here. Come on, Sochi. You get down, sweetie. She's going to go back for it because most cats are stubborn. They get discouraged and they want to go right back to it again. Oh, it's her persistence. Well, she might persist on this one. But notice it's a behavioral test. We didn't give Sochi a questionnaire. Now she's on her way back to look at what's covering the window here that's gently blowing in the breeze. And she's going to frickin' tear it all down any second because she's persistent. But I can observe this through behavior. Regardless, let's go back to the thematic apperception test. And the way this works, it's a projective test. We got two people. We got no idea what the deal is between these two people. What is their relationship? What just happened? What's likely to happen a couple minutes from now based on this picture? And that's how the test works. So it's like a Rorschach ink blot, but it uses pictures of people in semi-dynamic relationships. So you can say, well, hey, what's the relationship of these two people? What just occurred? What do you think is likely to occur? What are they each thinking? Right? Now the way this works is we go back to achievement, affiliation, and power. My statements about what I'm observing are now coded to represent a conversation about power, affiliation, right? And the idea then is, or achievement, that the number of times that I mention achievement issues, or the number of times I mention affiliation issues, or the extent to which I discuss a power differential if it exists, or equality in that fashion, would tend to indicate then my level of needs. I'm going to talk about needs that are most predominant in me. Now notice this is totally on the down low. The participant has no way of knowing what's being assessed or how it's being assessed. The benefits are it's kind of hard to fake unless a person's kind of relatively savvy about how projective tests work in psychology, and then we could certainly manipulate it. But for the average person off the street, no, they're not going to be able to do so. The problem is the scoring is insanely unreliable and it's insanely subjective. Now there are huge manuals and books and training to kind of make inter-rater reliability more accurate in these, but ultimately what have we learned about the person? Probably not a whole lot. So These transparent explicit versus opaque implicit measures, notice that the TAT is a great example of an opaque measure or non-conscious measure, because it's really tapping into non-conscious processes, whereas standardized questionnaires are usually, as you see, can be more explicit and tapping into more conscious constructs. Explicit tests tend to be obvious as to what's being tested, so you have to watch for faking. If we look at the gold standard, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, that's designed to look at personality constructs as well as mental disorder, it's very easy to fake because it's very obvious what the questions are asking. And that's why they have two lie scales or two fake scales embedded in that test. One is to determine if you're faking good or if you're trying to fake bad to avoid responsibilities. The more transparent the test, then the more you have to embed these kind of deception detection instruments, right? Notice with behavior, we can observe behavior, and it's a more genuine kind of test. Implicit tests effectively hide their purpose. It makes people less able to fake, but it becomes at the expense of defensibility. It increases the subjectivity, and then threatens the reliability of the test. So, what else can we look at then? Typical versus optimal performance. Typical performance measures how it's usually done. And for Michael, you asked the question between, what was it? Situational versus case interview. This is another way to kind of look at it. That situational, we might think in terms of being more assessing typical performance, where a case might be assessing more rarer performance situations, or in the language on this slide, optimal performance measures, right? So, typical performance measures is how it's usually done: personality, motivation, interest, beliefs. The optimal performance measures can look at one's best effort or when person is under the greatest level of challenge. So again, when I was tying critical incident techniques to the case style interview, it's probably more to challenge or to bring out potential optimal performance in a situation rather than the situational looking at kind of commonplace. So when we choose between tests, what's our advice here? Well, first of all, the initial trawl. So we're a trawler, we're a fishing boat, we cast out the net and see what we come up with. Where do you find tests? Well, and this ties to the find measure assignment that's coming up for you. There's manuals of testing. There's websites that discuss testing, right, and or sell testing. There's experiences of the contacts you'll meet and what they've used, or your own experiences of applying for jobs, right? So you produce then a list of potential tests, and then you start asking the question, well, here's my big master list of tests, but then, and let's go back to the repertory grid, because I like returning to what we've done before. If we're looking at clarity versus unclear, is the person delivering information clearly or unclear? What tests exist, right? And you might have then a list of 10 or 12 tests that you think in fact might tap into and then demonstrate their level of clarity, right? Does it measure the relevant characteristics? So you start asking these questions about the test you're looking at. Does it do it at the appropriate level? That is, if everyone's going to score 100% on this test, or 90 to 100%, then it's probably not useful because it's not going to differentiate the candidates. Practical considerations: how long does it take for the participant to take this test? That's one consideration, right? Because you're testing battery. How long are you going to ask applicants to come in? How much time do you have? And that also equals cost, which is the point just below that. But also, if you have to purchase the test, it's a cost issue, right? And also, when you think about time, also consider that it takes time to score tests as well. To what extent do you want to involve yourself with laborious and long scoring sessions, right? We can return to the matrix then to compare, and we've looked at the matrix, both the matrix and also your repertory grid, okay? And combine those two. Choosing between tests, at this point, you want to narrow the pack. You've done your initial trawl, you've got a long list of tests, right? But now you want to narrow the pack And some considerations might be pretty straightforward. Is it freely available? How long is the test? Getting back to the time, right? Or wearing the participant down. Excessive claims of reliability or validity, that is, you want to find numbers that demonstrate tests of reliability and validity. More on that next time, right? It's generally good to find a standard deviation that's small, right? Less variability in how the test measures. Does the test demonstrate a history of bias, right? Do norms exist for the test, which can facilitate your scoring? Like the IQ test is highly normed and highly reliable. Our problem with the IQ test is it's not very predictive of what happens on the job. But for a reliable test, it's extremely reliable and it's well normed, and there's all this data on those issues. And then, so do norms exist for the test? And more on validity is coming up, so you get that fun ahead of you. So let's call this one good, and we'll get back to issues of reliability and validity soon. Stay well, stay healthy, guys.